And I personally feel like our awards are even cooler than the Oscar. Just want to say that for the record. I think they're the most coveted award in Maine, aren't they? All right, I just want to say we won't be taking a break until our early lunch, so if you have needs for nourishment, coffee, or otherwise, please take care of yourself. And it is my privilege to introduce our first keynote speaker of today. And I want to thank MEMIC for being the sponsor of this keynote. Thank you, Mike. We actually tried to get Carlton on the bus with us during the federal tour, but somehow he was wise enough to duck that. Because early on this summer, when I started asking around about who do we know, who are we connected to in Maine that has national and international insights about where we can go, Carlton was one of the first names that came to my attention. So Carlton Owen is the president and CEO of the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, a $200 million entity created out of the Canada-U.S. Softwood Lumber Agreement in 2006, with a mission to support sustainable forestry and forest-reliant communities in the U.S. And in essence, they do what we've been talking about, which is push for both innovation in the industry and resiliency in the communities that have depended on the industry. Carlton is actually known to many in Maine because he's a former Champion Paper executive and worked on issues in this state. He's been at the forefront of conservation innovation for 40 years, a former executive director of the Sustainable Forestry Board. Among his achievements is Acres for America, which was at National Wildlife Foundation a $35 million 10-year partnership with Walmart to conserve 1 million acres of land, and they re-upped and doubled that commitment. It was such a success. He is on the board of CEI Capital Management and still finds excuses to come be part of the landscape here in Maine, and I thank Charlie Spees and CEI for helping to connect us. He's a forester and wildlife biologist, and in 2010, we need something like this. Maybe the governor could do this, Gene, George. In 2010, he was given the Order of the Palmetto, South Carolina's highest civilian honor. Does that mean we have to call you Sir Carlton Owen? All right, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Carlton Owen.
I'll tell my wife that sir is an option there, but I don't think it'll do any good. Thank you for letting me come back to Maine. I've never been part of a hostage crisis like this where you're brought into a room, you've got enthusiastic speakers like Yellow and Skip, and you're told that bathroom breaks are not an option. So I have a feeling none of you will fall asleep because you have your legs crossed, and please continue to do so. I'll try to make this rapid. I have been in Maine many times over the years. I've vacationed here many times. I've worked here a lot over the years. I've been here in the dead of winter, the warmth of summer. You talk about heat, but I live in South Carolina and grew up in Mississippi. But it's clear I'm from away. And no matter how long I come back, I'll always be from away. I had the opportunity a few years ago when we were just getting the endowment off the ground to get a phone call from a guy that would talk about economic development people. He was the economic development director of Franklin, Virginia, an international paper who I had a little run-in when they did a hostile takeover of Champion International. I will not go down that road with you. But when International Paper decided to shut down the Franklin paper mill, this guy got my name and he called me and he said, "Mr. Owen, I understand you have this endowment with $200 million. IP just shut down the Franklin mill, one of our largest employers. You've got to come help us." And I said, "Sir, call the Salvation Army, the United Way, because it's a short-term humanitarian crisis. The endowment is about long-term things." While we're talking, though, I thought, I think there are a couple of foundations in Franklin. So I'm Googling, and I'm a big Google fan, so I'm Googling while we're talking, and I pull up the tax returns of two foundations in the little town of Franklin, Virginia. Those two foundations collectively have more assets than the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. So I pull up their 990s, and I look at them and what they're doing in their communities. My peers in those two foundations are the most popular people in their communities. They give $5,000 to the garden club, $3,000 to the Boy Scouts, $200 to the paint the sign for the hockey stadium. They give a little bit of money to everybody. And I said, what you need to do, sir, is call those two foundations and tell them they need to become the drivers of social change in your community. You don't need them to be popular. You need them to be driving change. A couple of years after that, I had the privilege of meeting one of our few billionaires in the state of South Carolina. I know Maine's a poor state. I grew up in Mississippi. My children were born in Arkansas. I now live in South Carolina. I've been in every poor state in America. When I leave, the state's population and its economy gets better. So South Carolina's hoping I will move to somewhere else pretty soon, so South Carolina will step up on the economic ladder. But Darla Moore is a multi-billionaire who made her money on Wall Street and then moved back to her little hometown of Lake City, South Carolina. She's asked to speak all over the country about economic development and opportunity, and she was speaking to a community chamber group in a rural South Carolina community, and she said, tell me what you believe your assets are and your opportunities are. And they start talking about, well, we want to be the next Microsoft. We want to have space technology. We want to do all this stuff. And she said, but what are your assets? And they kept on with all these things of what they really wanted to be. And she said, look out the window and what do you see? And finally, one of the guys in the back said, all I see is a bunch of trees. She said, that's your asset. And when you look at Maine, 90% forested, the most forested state in America, that's your asset. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have the state of the past, but those trees and what they bring are one of your greatest assets. I don't come with any great answers to the challenges of Maine, but I can tell you I travel all over America. I've been to every state many times. Maine is not unique. You think you are. You do speak funny. I know that. I don't have an accent. You have an accent. We as an endowment and you at this wonderful institution have a lot in common. As a matter of fact, in our missions, there's one word that's very similar, sustainable. You don't need another boom or bust. You need long-term gain and change, and that typically doesn't come by the white buffalo. You don't need another large paper mill to come into Maine and save it. You need lots of invented here opportunities that are going to stay. I've watched in our area in Greenville, and we're one of the most booming areas in America. We've got BMW. We make all the little sports cars and the sports utility vehicles now. Many of them are shipped back to Europe. We become the tire mecca of the world. One of the things that worries me is that we're so dependent upon mega businesses rather than small business. You know, I was listening, and Carolyn, your civility button, and I'm assuming the reason these were brought is they weren't big sellers last night at the debate, so there were many of them left over. We at the endowment are about a couple of things. Number one, we're forest-centric, and we don't apologize for that. We want to keep forest as forest. We think the 1/3 of America covered by trees is a great thing. Trees are enormous factories. You can make anything out of a tree. You can make glass out of a tree, literally, ballistic glass that is just as translucent as any other glass. You can make Kevlar-type vests. You can make buildings that are warmer, have a less environmental footprint than any other building material on the planet. It's a 21st century product, but we look at it as a sector of the past all too often. We're about trees, and we're about rural, forest-rich communities and economic development. We want family wage jobs. And we're about North America. The endowment was created with a $200 million perpetual endowment to work on forest issues in the U.S. But we came out of a trade settlement between two sovereign governments, the U.S. and Canada. The collective forest estate between our two nations, and we're about equally 1/3 forest, is one of the largest forested estates on the planet. That's an opportunity. and it's not one that we can take for granted or assume we can do it all by ourselves. At the endowment, we don't do a lot of things. As a matter of fact, we try to do very few things, but large things. One of the problems with philanthropies in America is we're prone to want to rush to the newest hot item. One of my board members who was a speaker at our board a few years ago before we were finally enticed to come on the board said, it's often 7 to 10 years as you're into an investment before you really know if you're making the difference that you hope to. Change doesn't come rapidly. We also want to do things others can't or won't, so you don't see us making a lot of small investments. We don't sponsor conferences, we don't sponsor scholarships and books. We try to do the things that others will not do. And we've been very successful in doing some of those things. And I don't have time to go into them today, but here's some of the initiatives we work in. We want to keep every sawmill job and paper mill job we can, but that's not good enough. We want new jobs that are tied to the forest, and one of the most important forest assets and forest products has nothing to do with the products you make out of the tree, but 2 out of 3 Americans every day get their drinking water from a forest. The water here in Portland is not coming from the ocean and the bays surrounding us, it's coming from a forested watershed. We're working with people of color to help them acknowledge and recognize that forests in many places are the asset they have to climb the economic ladder. We're working on the bio-based energy economy that's been talked about here a couple of times. We're working on forest health issues. We have enormous challenges in this country, some of them driven by climate change, some of them driven by the fact that we've not been actively managing our forests, especially public lands, for decades. And it's left our forest in enormous threat. The catastrophic wildfires you see, fires are natural, especially in the parts of the country we see them in most often in the Northwest. But the level of those fires is not natural, and it's from lack of management and climate change. In my career, 40 years, I've ridden the industry up, and if we stay on the trajectory we're on, I'll ride the industry down, but it doesn't have to be that way. We've lost, not just in Maine, but in North America, 500,000 family wage jobs in the forest products sector since the recession. Now, if that happened like it happened in the automotive industry, Congress would have been doing something, but it didn't happen. We're not like Detroit. It's 200 jobs in Lincoln, it's 100 jobs in Camden, South Carolina, it's 50 jobs in Morton, Washington, but 500,000 of the highest paying, best benefit jobs in America, and they're gone. Nearly 1/3 of all the jobs in the sector are gone. That's every man, woman, and child in Portland. Not this Portland, the other one. Gone. Why do we not get the attention that other sectors get? Because we're a diverse, we're dispersed sector, scattered across the country, scattered in these small towns. It's more like a cancer than a natural disaster. When the tornado hits, and I grew up in Tornado Alley in Mississippi, when the tornado hits, everybody rallies because it happens instantly. When job loss occurs like it tends to occur in rural America, it happens over decades. Pat and I were talking last night. We knew those mills were going to close. We just didn't know what year. We knew it wasn't decades out. We knew it was coming. Some of the drivers of change are not unique to Maine. This is not a Maine problem. This is a North American problem. Technology is driving much of it. Technology has always been disruptive, but 70% of newsprint capacity is gone. How many of you get the daily newspaper in hard copy? Yeah. How many of you have gray hair or no hair and do that? Yeah. 40% of the printing and writing paper is gone. It's not going to come back. It's a changing economy. That mill that you talked about, the new mill in Maine, what does it make? A tissue product. We want tissue products. It's also one that you don't ship very easily because you're shipping air. As a matter of fact, I've talked to people in that area. You try to cube out a truck, which means you get all the stuff you can on a truck, and you cube it out long before you get to the total weight because it's shipping air. The other growth sector beyond tissues is boxes again. Why? Amazon and other shipments. My children don't go into a store anymore. They're 35 and 31. When I'm at my son's house outside of Philadelphia, the area around the front entry is stacked with boxes. Every day, FedEx or UPS drops off one or more boxes at their house. It's unbelievable. It's just a tsunami of boxes coming into the house. Those are the growth areas. We have opportunities, but why? I was thinking last night about this part of the world. We're great at stealing from each other. Maine is one of the older sectors of the U.S. economy. You had some textile industry a few decades ago, didn't you? And where did it go to? Oh yeah, South Carolina. We borrowed a little of that. As a matter of fact, my town now, my hometown, was the textile capital of the world. And 30 years ago, textiles began to go not back to Maine, not to Alabama, but to Asia. And we lost thousands of those textile jobs. Listen at this. Textiles in America that was largely offshored 30 years ago invest more in R&D today than America's forest product sector on a percentage of sales. They put in 0.7%. We put in 0.5%. And I've talked to CEOs in our industry, and they said, we can't afford to put more in. Every study I read says if you're not putting in about 2%, you're going backwards. And I'm not talking about high tech where Apple is putting in 30 or 40%. The average manufacturing industry in America puts around 3 to 4% in R&D to stay competitive. Textiles is putting more money into R&D than the sector I've worked in for 40 years. We've got to change. Maine has some special challenges. You've always been special. You're special in my heart. I have spent a lot of time in Maine. Your energy costs are among the highest in the nation. Your workers' comp costs are amongst the highest in the nation. Your trees grow a little slower than they do where I grew up. And our trees grow a heck of a lot slower than where I've worked in Indonesia and Brazil. You're not going to outcompete the world in growth. You've got to come at it a different way. And your infrastructure is aging, both the mills and the people, which has been mentioned a couple of times. Those are challenges, not insurmountable odds. You can deal with them. This is the century of forest. Not the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, or 1900s, or even the 20th century. This is the century of forest. We have the factory that produces the materials that society needs. They sequester carbon, whether they're growing or whether you convert them into a product. They yield water. The tree produces over 200 chemicals. It is a factory standing on a stump. Just a few of the products here. I've already mentioned water. Water is the most critical. And if we can link communities to their forests for water, we can protect those forests for future generations. But they don't need to be set aside to produce clean water. You can produce clean water from a working forest that yields other benefits. Nanotechnology. We're funding work here at the University of Maine. Nanotechnology holds the potential to replace at a much higher value per unit the jobs we've lost in the pulp and paper sector. We're not going to bring back tens of thousands of them, but if you look at studies around the world, nanotechnology is the next big area. It's hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars of economic opportunity. Well, we can make nano out of oil, we can make nano out of metals, or we can make nano out of cellulose. I think God had a pretty good plan on something that is renewable and sustainable, so we probably ought to be doing something. You're the Saudi Arabia of cellulose. You need to be doing something with it that produces high value and high opportunity. And then you produce a lot of lumber. And as was mentioned in one of the last presentations, you're right next door to almost a third of the people in this country. The opportunities abound for mass timber construction, which is nothing more than, we've seen plywood, which is little thin layers of veneer cross-laminated, and it makes a much stronger product than the individual tree does. Cross-laminated timbers or mass timbers is nothing other than putting lumber in those cross, and you end up with a structure that is sequestering huge amounts of carbon, is seismic resistant, earthquakes. It can be used in so many applications. You could literally build a 40 or 60-story building out of wood. You can't do that with 2x4s, but you can do it with mass timbers. And many people in the cement and steel industry, that's just a fire trap. Anybody put a big log in a fireplace? You put a little bitty stick in a fireplace and it burns quickly. Put a big log in, what happens? It chars on the outside, but it burns very slowly. Look at a building built out of mass timbers after a fire, and the structures that are left are the wooden beams, not the steel beams. Steel melts and it collapses. We have opportunity beyond belief. I'm going to give you just a couple of ideas, and there are dozens of opportunities, but two things that strike me about Maine's opportunity. One is, such as the small things and Katahdin, do the small projects, get the quick gains, and I agree with that. One of the quick gains for Maine is you're the highest per capita user of imported energy in the whole United States. Why do you keep sending your energy dollars out of the state? What is your energy? You're surrounded by wood fiber. And yet you send your money with number 2 heating oil out of the state. 75 to 80 cents out of every one of those energy dollars goes somewhere else. But if you use wood, 75 to 80 cents of every one of those dollars stays in your community, benefiting you and your neighbors. That's an enormous opportunity today. Now, the legislature has got some goals by 2030 and by 2050. How many of you are going to be here in 2050? Y'all going to be back for yellow in the meeting in 2050? Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, you lie about that and you lie about other things too. This needs to be a today issue. We've worked with Northern Forest Center on some changes in other communities. Maine Forest Service has done work in this area. This is a today opportunity. People's boilers are going out. They're going to replace them. And yeah, oil is cheap right now. And every friggin' dollar you spend on it goes to benefit somebody else. Why wouldn't you make that conversion to wood now? This isn't your great-grandfather's wood either. This is stuff that is extremely efficient, extremely environmentally friendly, and the pollutants are non-existent. That's today. You can start putting millions and millions of dollars into the pockets of consumers and the economies of rural Maine today. You don't have to wait for some big thing to come in the future. But let's talk about a couple of big things that could come. You can wait for the white knight to ride in and build a big mill, and I have a feeling you're going to be waiting a long time. Those white knights are tending to look for places where the trees are growing much quicker, where opportunity is better, where employees are younger, better educated. You better do something different and grab your own future. And the way to do that is a new business model. I'm a private sector capitalist. The bulk of my 40 years have been in industry. I'm a free marketer, but free markets are not perfect. Government's not perfect. Private sector's not perfect. But when we come together, we have enormous opportunity because we bring the different sets of values and opportunities together. We've got a new thing in America called the Beef Corp, the Benefit Corp, where its purpose is not to maximize just profit. Now, it wants to make profit, but it wants to maximize social benefits as well, and it's legal under the system. So when you hear somebody in a private company say, well, my job is to maximize shareholder return or whatever else, to a great extent, they're being driven by external forces. What if we created a B Corp in Maine, and it had state government funding, maybe a little bit of federal government funding, maybe a consortium of sawmills, maybe some of the nonprofits, community foundations and others in this room, maybe even folks like us from the endowment. We're doing some of this on other products in other parts of the country. And we jump-started the opportunity for mass timbers, which, what does it do? Well, number one, it takes a lot of the low-value timber that you can't sell right now and puts it in the middle of that cross-laminated timber, because we don't care what's in the middle, we just want strength. We don't want appearance. On the outside of it, you want appearance, so you use your better quality lumber there. So we strengthen those sawmills. Oh yeah, by the way, doing this, we're going to need some drying technology, so let's use our waste wood to generate the material and the heat to do the drying, and let's begin helping, not the 40-story skyscraper in New York City, that's pie in the sky. It may come someday, but what about 6, 8, 10, 12-story buildings? How many 10-story buildings are there in the state of Maine? Count them on a hand, maybe? But there are thousands of buildings that could be made out of cross-laminated timber that help that Maine economy and help you become an innovator in an area that's going to come. You can wait for it to come, or you can choose to come at it in a different way in a consortium approach. And let me tell you something about consortia. They're messy, and they're not as much fun as if you're a dictator and you hold all the assets and you just tell other people what to do. How many of you have that opportunity in the room where everybody does what you want them to do? I'm still working on my wife of 44 years, and I am failing miserably. Near-term opportunities, long-term opportunities, they're yours for the taking. But it's going to take creativity. It's going to take reaching across the aisle, not Democrats to Republicans, but industry to environmental groups, rural communities. One of the things we've done, and we've made a major investment in Maine and New England a few years back on regional economic development. There are very few forest-reliant towns that have all the assets they need. But when you look at the region, you have everything you need. I grew up in a little town in northeast Mississippi called Pontotoc, near Tupelo. Our only claim to fame is Elvis was born in Tupelo. I was born in Pontotoc. We don't have my house, it's not set up, but someday there'll be a sign there that Carlton was born here. My first cousin became mayor, and this was an area that was very troubled. He and the mayors of several surrounding towns got together, and this is now written up as a case study, and they attracted the Toyota plant. And the reason they did it is they didn't say, oh, we don't want it to go in Tupelo, we want it to come to Pontotoc. No, well, New Albany, we don't want them. Those guys don't speak well over there in New Albany. They talked about their region, and they marketed their region with the idea that wherever the plant went, all would benefit. And it's been a wonderful success story. So when we look at your region, and your region bumps up against another country last time I checked, your region is not just Maine, it's not just Vermont, New Hampshire. Your region includes Canada, and we need to be thinking about a North American agenda because they've got some of the same problems we've got. They speak most of the time the same language we do. Now, there are a few people, progress and process, and then there's the Quebecers, but we won't go there. There's opportunity. It's going to take an all-hands approach. It's a marathon. It is not a sprint. Let me tell you one last story here. My hometown now, we've been there 26 years in Greenville, South Carolina. It was dying. Textile mills were gone. Very little hope. Uneducated people that didn't have places to go. And a handful of families decided they weren't going to let their town die. Matter of fact, at dinner last night, we were talking about that. What's the secret sauce? The secret sauce is not the governor, the president. The secret sauce is a few folks that will say, my town is going to survive, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to change to make it different. One of those change agents in our town, and I never got to meet him, he died before I got to know him, was an Austrian Jew who came to Greenville escaped the Nazis, and he was in the textile industry. Downtown Greenville, when I moved there 26 years ago, was boarded up. It looked a lot like Millinocket, only bigger. And this mayor says, we're going to attract a major investment and we're going to put tax dollars in it. And he put tax dollars in a Hyatt hotel. The only time I'm aware of that this happened anywhere in America. 30 years ago. They got that money back last year. That decision to make a public-private investment started a cascade of events that over 30 years, that's a marathon, has led to Greenville being one of the most vibrant, most sought after, most studied communities in America. We don't have many of the assets you do. We don't have Bucksport, and I know Bucksport extremely well, right there on the water. We don't have Mount Katahdin. Greenville's an inland city that lost its industry. It should have died. But a public-private partnership 30 years ago, before it was even something that was talked about, became the first domino in a string of dominoes that has led to us becoming one of the most vibrant communities in America. So it's a long-term race. You need everybody. You need state government, federal government. You need recreationists. No, by the way, let me go ahead and hit my pot here. That the endowment takes no positions on policy issues. The Maine Woods issue is over. It should have been over 2 years ago. A generation from now, people are going to say that Roxanne Quimby, and I don't know her, this is not a commercial for her, Roxanne Quimby's decision was a wonderful gift to America and to the citizens of Maine. It's 0.5% of the working forest of Maine. You don't have a shortage of trees. You've got a shortage of markets. You're not going to have the old timber industry come back. You need a more diverse economy. And that economy is going to be based on healthy, clean water. You showed where it is now. Try keeping it there. That's a hard deal. That water will bring you investment because water is going to be one of the most limited resources in this century that will stall economic development all over the world. You've got a great asset. You need to pull people together. Let me end on two thoughts. One is by your own senator. And I had the privilege of meeting with Angus in his office when he was governor a few years ago, and he and I got along famously. His accent is much better than most of yours, by the way. Angus, in the mentioning of the EDAT, said, nobody expects we'll solve the problems of the pulp and paper and forest products industry here in Maine in 3 days. We'll analyze the problems and assess where the opportunities might be, and then we'll develop a strategy for getting there. Angus King. One of my favorite writers is a pastor out in Southern California, Rick Warren, and this is what he says. We have to make intentional choices in order to grow. There's no growth without change. There's no change without loss. And there's no loss without pain. If you're going to grow, you'll have to change. And change means you've got to let go of some old things in order to grab some new things. Maine has enormous opportunities. You have assets out the kazoo, clean water and lots of forest and people that love to come visit, and you want them to come visit, you want them to leave their dollars, but you need to be putting your own dollars in Maine. You don't need to wait on the white knight to come in. Develop new partnerships and let Maine be the model for business models for the America of the future. Thank you for letting me be with you.
Hang on 1 second. It just fell apart, she said. Carlton, that was awesome. I think he said enormous opportunity about 75 times. So at least that's what I heard. We are going to not take Q&A to get ourselves a little back on schedule, but we also know we have the privilege of having Carlton here all day. So hopefully any of you can have some great conversations with him to explore some of these different ideas. We have a little something from Maine for you, if you have room to take it back, and we so much appreciate you broadening our perspective. Thanks so much, Carlton.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.